Hi, everybody. I'm Wendy Murdoch, and this is Webinars with Wendy. I am continuing this series of webinars because you, my audience, tell me that you love them and you want me to do more. If you have a guest that you would like me to see if I can get on the show, I can't promise, but we will certainly reach out. So just send me an email at wendy@wendymurdoch.com or pop me a message at info@murdochmethod.com, and we'll see if we can find those guests. Since the pandemic is kind of, I wouldn't say over, but people are back to normal, it's a little bit more difficult because everybody's gotten very busy again. But anyway, today my guest is Evelien, and she is from she's broadcasting from the Netherlands, which is her home country, right? But she has been, is a graduate student in Washington State. Mm-hmm. Okay, so welcome, Evelien. I'm going to let you do your introductions because I'm still like a little frazzled from trying to get Zoom to work today. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. So hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Evelien, and like Wendy said, I am from the Netherlands. I'm currently in the Netherlands because I'm on my summer break. But I'm a graduate student, doctoral student at Washington State University. I moved from the Netherlands to the US about 4 years ago, and I'm an anthropologist. So I study human cultures. And within that, I focus on people's relationships with animals from a cultural perspective. Of course, horses, because that's, the one thing that we all care about. So yeah, I study what people do with horses in different cultural contexts and how we can learn more about those relationships by looking at the cultural systems in which people are embedded.
So do you look at it historically as well, like how people and horses work together in the past and then how that relates to today?
A little bit. So anthropologists, we kind of zoom in on a specific community. So for example, I started out a couple of years ago researching rodeo and specifically the role of bucking horses in rodeo in the American Northwest. So you incorporate the history of rodeo because you need to do a lit review for your study and you need to collect what has been written about this topic. So you do need to include it in your work, but we generally look at contemporary societies. But by studying the history of rodeo, I also learned that people's perceptions towards those horses had changed. So good thing I did, look at the literature.
Wow, that's really fascinating. That's really cool. So you've looked at rodeo. Are there other sort of, I would say, subsets that you've looked at besides rodeo in terms of our relationships?
I started out, well, my plan was to do research in Colombia and Latin America. So that's the idea that I got admitted with at Washington State University. But then the first week there, I actually went to a local rodeo and I saw what it was, because from the Netherlands, I'd never seen a rodeo before.
Really true.
So I was like, you know what, I'm just quickly gonna focus on rodeo for just a couple of years, and then I'll travel to Latin America, later in my graduate program. And then just as I had finished all my rodeo work, the pandemic hit, so I didn't want to go abroad. So now I'm focusing on the medical management of horses in the Northwest region, trying to figure out how people's culture influences how they treat horses, how they perceive sickness and ailments and all that. So long story short, I started out focusing on rodeo. I finished that project, and now I'm looking at equine diseases from a cultural perspective.
Oh, wow, this is so interesting because there's also rodeo. I was in Costa Rica, and they still have rodeo, and so it's not just an American event; it's a Latin American event as well. Yeah. And probably I would assume is also in Argentina, Colombia. Yeah. So I don't know what you're planning on talking about today, but can you touch on that a bit as well as on the medical side? Because I find this fascinating.
Yeah, of course. So when I went to my first rodeo, I couldn't really understand what bucking horses were all about, because I'm not from a place where we have that tradition. And I saw those horses and I was like, what is going on here? They're not wild like Mustangs, but are they made to buck? Because apparently, the bucking is what they're all about. So like, how does that work? Are these animals kept feral? And I mean, if you Google rodeo and bucking horses, you get a lot of those animal advocacy websites, and that only gives you a particular view on rodeo. But I was like, well, what is going on behind the scenes? Like, what are these horses about, and what are the relationship with those, between those people and those horses all about? And I think one of my main findings was that the relationship between bucking horses and the people who ride them, but also the people who breed them, the stock contractors, is a lot more complex than, animal advocacy groups make you think. Because I mean, they portray it as these animals are being exploited, and of course horse riding and exploitation, I mean, there is something to say for it. But if you look at rodeo, those horses are part of such a big system of not centuries, decades, like breeding programs that go back decades, family identity, personal emotions as well. And emotions towards livestock, because bucking horses are livestock, may be different than how we perceive our pet horses, but their emotions nonetheless. Stock contractors take a lot of pride in the performance of their bucking horses. And if a horse does well, if it becomes kind of like an individual, those horses mean a lot for the people that own them. And there is this whole business around, breeding them, their breeding programs, keeping the horses in sort of like a natural environment or a natural habitat, not messing with them too much, because they don't want those horses to lose that edge that they have. But I mean, they don't just pluck them out of the field and put a bucking strap on them and be like, good luck, buck. It doesn't work like that. They get, I don't want to say trained, but they do get accustomed to the strap and to the weight of somebody on their back, and they're being introduced to a smaller rodeo first and then a bigger one. So that the bucking horse industry is a lot more complex than I knew it was, or that it is if you just read those advocacy websites, for example. So it's very interesting. It's a very interesting thing.
I'm so glad to hear you say this, because I think, I don't know if it's just Americans, but we tend to want to just pluck one little tiny thing out of a situation and then blow it up out of proportion. And in the Kentucky Derby recently, the winning horse had bitten, right, the pony horse and the pony guy, the guy who's the outrider. And so here is another example of something that's incredibly complex. It's a dangerous job. He does an amazing job, and how it's been blown out of proportion by people who completely don't understand what it's about and only take this little tiny slice of things and then say that's it. And when I think about bucking horses and race horses, there's a lot of political issues about it. But when, like you say, when you start to understand, first of all, the horse's job only lasts 8 seconds, right? And yet horses that are say ridden or doing other jobs, it's hours, maybe, their environment. So it's like a lousy 8 seconds. And then this horse is pampered and treated like royalty. If he's good, he's like, and it's the same thing with the bulls. I know with the bulls, it's the, people, but the bulls are revered. They're treated with the utmost respect and care, and to make sure they're healthy and they can do their job, because their job is so important in such a larger context. And so I'm actually thrilled to hear you talk about this, because I think that we don't bother as a culture to look a little deeper and ask some really simple questions of, what is this job really? How is the bigger picture? What is the social structure around this event? And how self-worth and value and income and all those things that go along with the industry are ignored, and yet they're so important to what we do with horses in general. Like if they're Yeah. So can you talk about that a bit? Like, what were some of the most interesting things that you discovered? And it's so interesting because you come from a culture where you had no idea what this was about. So it's
Mhm.
almost in a way better because you had to like go into it with a very open mind to see what was going
Yeah.
on.
Well, so I've presented my work on rodeo at a couple international conferences, and what I didn't realize at first, kind of the mistake that I made, is that not everybody feels this way about rodeo. I mean, there are plenty of people who are against it. I mean, sometimes for valid reasons, I don't want to say that. But what I always try to make clear is that as an anthropologist, I'm not trying to judge what people do. I mean, of course, I have my personal opinion about stuff, but I also, on the other hand, I have my professional attitudes towards the work that I do. And I'm not an animal advocate per se, but I can provide the work that people can use to make a what's the word for it? Like an educated opinion about it, I guess.
Yeah. And therefore
Um,
policy decisions, right? Because policy
yeah,
decisions
also
come
that.
from that. Yeah.
Yeah. And with rodeo, I mean, there's so many groups that, and I don't want to, talk badly about those groups because they have their function as well. But I mean, if you're against rodeo, well, then measure what you think is going on, do a study, measure stress levels or heart rates or something, like measure something. Um, and that's what I think where anthropology comes in. At least we are giving, I mean, yeah, it's a social study, but we are giving an account of what is going on, and we're including different perspectives so that, like you said, policymakers or animal scientists or, the general public can make an opinion based on facts and scientific data, and then decide how they feel about stuff. I mean, does that answer your question? I'm not
Yeah,
quite sure.
this is the thing is, um, sadly, and I think this is kind of where our culture, at least here in the United States, has gone, is it's all about the shock factor, or it's all about the emotional factor, and we don't ask anything other than if we can enrage people. That seems to be the way we operate nowadays, right?
Mhm.
And we're, in many ways, we make decisions irrationally. We don't make rational decisions because our emotional brain takes over and just goes, and people, hate to say it, but we're preyed upon in that way. And yet, if we, like you did, you went in and went, well, let me explore this and understand this. When you go in and actually look at what's going on and start to understand it, there's so many, it's complex, and we don't like complex. We want it, simple.
Yeah.
And so the complexity, what were some of the complexities about rodeo that you discovered when you did your study that surprised you, or you didn't expect, or that was unusual for you?
Well, when I was doing my interviews, initially I would ask my informants, for the people that I interviewed, like, are these horses wild? How do you keep them wild? Can you list which animals you think are wild? And then can you list which animals are tame, and are bucking horses tame animals? So I was trying to figure out, okay, what are they? But they're, in my mind at least, I still have some trouble really grasping it because, like you said, I am a cultural outsider. But I think one of the most interesting things to me is the fact that bucking horses are not wild animals, yet they have to be kept in this semi-feral, I mean, if you do want to put a term on it, like a semi-feral state, because people explain to me, well, these horses are bred to buck. It's in their instinct. That is their response to that pressure on their back and that pressure of the bucking strap and all that. So it is part of their nature, the same way that running is part of the nature of a racehorse. So I asked them, well, if this is part of their nature, why don't you halter break those horses a bit more so you can lead them around? Wouldn't that be a lot easier for you than loading them from like chute to chute and all that? And they were like, well, no, because then they will lose their edge. And I was like, well, but they're bred for this, so they have that edge. So why would it matter if you were to like halter break them or, brush them, from my like pet horse perspective or whatever? That to me is still a little bit difficult to comprehend. Probably because, because of the pandemic, I couldn't spend more face-to-face time with the stock contractors and the horses themselves. But that's a question that to some extent still remains unanswered, because I still haven't fully been able to grasp the I don't want to say the nature of the horses, but what the horses are all about. Because I mean, if it is part of their nature, why do they have to be kept a certain way? So I feel that that is some cultural knowledge that needed deeper, just more research, like a deeper comprehension from my perspective.
Yeah.
To,
Somebody's just said what I was thinking. It would be a good experiment for somebody to do, is to simply
Yeah.
halter break a group and not halter break a group and
Uh-huh.
put them into a rodeo and find out if they both do the same, to perform the same. And so that could be just a sort of a myth. It could be a myth, but we don't know unless we look at it.
Mm-hmm.
And then how are these horses kept when they're not at rodeo? How are they kept?
Oh my God, they have a life that I am jealous of. So they basically live in these huge fields in big herds. So they're always eating grass. They are fed hay in the winter. When it's time for a rodeo, they're also fed grain, or at least at the rodeo they get some grain to give them some extra nutrients. But those are some good-looking horses. They're chunky, they're shiny, they look great. And if you compare that to some of the sport horse barns I've been to in my area, I'm like, oh, these horses would be jealous of those bucking horses, because they live a life of freedom. Basically, it's 99% of the time they live in their natural state. They live in a big field. They're surrounded by other horses. They're bred naturally. Sometimes they just select a herd of mares and then release a stallion, and they breed naturally. So it's an ideal life. It's free of hunger. It's free of discomfort and all that. From what I know, they get their vet checkup before the rodeo season, because the horses do need to be vaccinated and all that, because they're still horses. So they do need to get checked out before they can leave for the rodeo. So that is when the veterinarian comes to see them. They get their dewormer, they get their vaccinations, they get their feet done if needed. So they live lives of extreme luxury, from a horse's perspective. I mean, they do have to do some work for it, but that is not, the same work that our pleasure horses have to do, or that we have to do as people.
So in many ways, actually, they're living in a much more natural environment, being in a herd, being out together, and being well cared for than a lot of horses that might not otherwise be able to be turned out.
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you went to rodeos, you actually went to rodeos, and I don't know if I would assume that there's a vet on site who's there to make sure that things are taken care of, and that horses aren't, if they're injured in any way, they're taken care of, and they get that care as well.
Yeah, from what I know is that the bigger rodeos always have a veterinarian present, or at least on call, but I'm sure there's one present as well. And I asked one of the people I interviewed, I was like, well, is there a veterinarian that checks them before the show? Like you see on like dressage or endurance, there's always a vet present, and you have to let them check that horse before you're allowed to compete. And that stock contractor looked at me and he was like, why would I want to, let a lame horse enter this rodeo? Why would I even do that? So my silly quote unquote question was answered back immediately. I was like, I have no interest in like taking a lame horse with me to the rodeo. If they discover that one is lame, they either leave it at the ranch. If they discover it at the rodeo, they take it out of the competition, or whatever you want to call it. And if needed, they call the vet for it. And that may range from painkillers to acupuncture to like electrotherapy. Oh yeah, like a lot of money goes into these animals, and a lot of money is invested into keeping them sound. There's a couple stock contractors that I haven't interviewed, but that keep these really cool videos on Instagram, for example, so you can follow everything. They're really transparent about it. They'll have videos of their horses being checked by veterinarians. And I mean, they're bucking horses, so they have to be in a chute, but they get all the care they need to stay sound. And any self-respecting stock contractor is not going to take a lame horse, is not consciously going to take a lame horse to a show, and is not going to let a lame horse compete. Like, no, that doesn't happen.
So I always think, because I've seen rodeo, it's like the rider is expendable. They're the ones that get broken and bashed and trampled and everything else. And the horses are pampered. And yet it's the horses we tend to go, oh, this is cruel. And yet it's the people. It's like...
I know. Well, the argument is that the horses don't have a say in it. Like a bucking horse, if they buck well, that is their career. And if the horse doesn't want it, you could argue that it doesn't really have a choice. On the other hand, though, like if a bucking horse doesn't want to buck, if that sensation of the rider and the bucking strap doesn't entice it to buck, then it's, the stock contractor is not going to use it because the horse isn't going to do its job, and the rider isn't going to score those points, and the horse isn't going to score those points. So, I mean, there's something to say it from both perspectives. Like philosophically, you could say that the horse doesn't have a lot of agency because nobody is asking it, do you want to be a bucking horse, yes or no, sign this contract please. But on the other hand, if that horse doesn't want it, it's not going to buck. Like they don't force those animals to perform that way. And if that horse doesn't buck, then they're not going to use it for rodeo. They're going to either use it for a smaller rodeo, maybe breed with it, or maybe just remove it from their string of rodeo horses.
So do they have a scoring system for bucking horses in terms of quality of bucking?
Yeah, it's when they test those horses when they're still young, they start out using those horses for the smaller, like high school rodeos, and as that horse gets older and better, they start using it for bigger rodeos and bigger rodeos. And those top horses, those are the ones that they send to the finales every year in Las Vegas, and that's an honor for that stock contractor to be contracted for the national rodeo finals and to have his horses there, and her horses, it could be either or. And even at the finals, you have categories of horses. Like the further you get into the competition, the more difficult they want those horses to be. So there's all these different categories and gradients of skill level and how that horse bucks and how intensely the bucks are, how good they are as well, because the horse has to move, but the rider has to be able to move with it. So there's a whole intrinsic system to it that you really have to talk to those people in order to understand and to learn what that system is.
So in other words, a horse that doesn't buck is essentially going to be moved out of the system because it can't do the job and the riders can't score, and therefore it's not going to be a useful horse. So in a way, it sounds to me like these horses actually learn their job and know their job and become good at their job.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. They're, behind the scenes when they're in their paddocks or whatever, just waiting, they are the chillest horses ever. Not all of them, you cannot approach all of them. Some are more used to people than others, but they're not wild until they are in that chute and until that like girth in the bucking strap is attached, and they know what time it is. They know exactly what is expected of them. They know they get released as soon as that rider is gone, as soon as the bucking strap is gone. They know exactly what is expected of them.
So I'm so glad we're having this conversation, because whether it's bucking horses, race horses, or any horses in our sport, there is this deeper understanding that we need to have, as opposed to just judging, oh, that's bad. And as we have the deeper understanding, like talking to you about this and recognizing that these horses are graded, they're evaluated, they're cared for, they're respected, they're learning their job. And so it's fascinating, because I think the bulls are the same way. Mm-hmm. They know what's expected of them. They know it's a very short period of time. When you think about their lifespan, if they work an hour in their life, like it would be, 60 minutes, that would be a lot. and with the rest of it. So I don't know. I think I could figure that job out and enjoy that and not have to spend these hours on the
Right?
computer to do other things. It's really fascinating. All right. So we've talked about bucking horses, and then the pandemic hit, and then you started looking at horses in need of care. Explain the second part of your study.
So the introduction I always give to it is that what we saw with the COVID pandemic is people using ivermectin to treat COVID, right? Or to prevent COVID. Something that we see in the United States and also to an extent in Canada is that all of a sudden people started using an equine worming agent or deworming agent, I guess, to treat COVID in themselves. And that demonstrate that people's understandings of the workings of their bodies, they're not universal. There's a lot of cultural variability in the way we think our bodies work and the way we think medicine works and all that, and also how we respond to illnesses. And in anthropology, we study this a lot for people, because anthropology is a science of the study of people, or like people's cultures and all that. So there's a lot of work that revolves around human medicine. But those questions weren't really asked about animal medicine. Like, we were studying animal medicine, but not to an extent as we were studying it with humans. So I was like, how does that work then with humans? Like, what part of veterinary medicine, and I don't mean just what the veterinarians do, but also what lay people like me, for example, what we do, to what extent is that universal, and to what extent is it cultural? When we think of cultural variability in horsemanship, it's easy to think of maybe non-Western societies, and it's easy to think of people using like herbal medications or herbal medicines and all that. Like, that is what your mind almost instinctively goes to. But, you know, Dutch veterinary medicine, American veterinary medicine, or like English or British veterinary medicine is cultural as well. So what I want to know is, how does our culture pattern these minds and these bodies of these animals? How does our culture pattern how we treat them and how we manage their health and their illness? I hope I explain it well. I've been thinking about this, like, how am I going to explain this? Because I can, write it all down in a grant proposal, but how am I going to explain this to, a broader audience? But that's what I'm looking into. What part of veterinary medicine is indeed either natural or universal, and how much of it is cultural, and what does that cultural variability mean for the horses and the people that are involved in that?
So it sounds like, let me just see if I can say this. You're looking at veterinary medicine for horses in terms of what is more biological, in other words, based on the beast itself, and what is more cultural, based on the people involved with the horse.
Sorta, yeah. So, like, all societies have medical systems, and in some societies the medical system is a shaman. In some societies that medical system is somebody's grandma, or it may be a doctor with a PhD from Harvard, for example. So all societies have some form of care for sick people. And you see that in societies that have animals as well. Like, most people who have animals have their techniques to help those animals when those animals get sick. So that's kind of like a given fact. That is the universal that we see in all cultures. But what does sickness mean to people? Like, what is the notion of illness, or what is the notion of health mean to people in different societies? And what does that mean for the veterinary care in itself? So if you, on one hand, have somebody who breeds like top dollar barrel horses, and on the other hand, you have a backyard breeder who, breeds a couple foals each year, but doesn't really do a lot with those animals, does health and illness mean the same thing for these people? Or is a healthy horse for that backyard breeder maybe an ill horse for that barrel horse breeder? Like, what is the influence of culture on the way we perceive sick horses? And what does it mean for those animals? If somebody thinks, oh yeah, that horse is lame, but it'll be okay, then they're not going to call the vet. But if somebody is like, oh, my horse has a tiny little scratch, I need to call the vet for that, the vet is being called. So what is that cultural influence on how we manage the health and the healthcare of our horses?
And do you find an economic factor? I'm sure you find an economic factor in
Mm-hmm.
those decisions.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. It's not just, what is our ideal image? How do we perceive a healthy horse? But it's of course also what can we afford? Because we all know that ill horses or sick horses are terribly expensive, of course. So financial constraints strongly pattern how we manage that healthcare. Coincidentally, one of the veterinarians at my school at Washington State University, she recently conducted a project about pain medication, about what kinds of pain medications people have at home, like over-the-counter stuff or stuff they buy on the internet, and how do they use it? Do they listen to their veterinarian, or do they kind of just use it at will? And I sort of had those same conclusions, like a lot of people, especially in the area where I live, where veterinarians are kind of, far away and it costs you hundreds of dollars to call the vet out to your farm. They have a lot of stuff at home, they have their own painkillers, they have their own vaccinations and all that. But that also means that they vaccinate themselves and that they deworm themselves, that they deworm the horses themselves, and that they use painkillers at their own discretion. So what does it mean for those horses? Do they use too much? Do they use too little? Do they over-vaccinate? Do they under-vaccinate? Do they deworm? When do they deworm? What do they give? Is it effective? So all those different cultural variabilities that we see, even in an area as small, in American terms, as the inland Northwest in the United States, has a lot of cultural variability that has to do, like what you said, with economic factors, sometimes even with people's political views. Like it's all kind of ingrained or entangled in each other, that whole what we call culture of veterinary care.
So how are you parsing this, or how are you kind of going about studying this? Because what you've described is really complex. There's a lot of moving parts.
Yeah. It's interviewing people. It's literally just interviewing people and asking them as much as I can ask them. I think what I've planned for my current study is over 200 interviews over the course of 6 months, and literally just asking people, a range of different questions. What does a healthy horse mean to you? What does an ill horse mean to you? What different categories of illness are there according to you? But also stuff about what kind of medications do you have in your trailer or in your barn? At what point do you call the vet? How much money do you have available? Do you think horses have souls? What happens to a horse when it gets sick? Do you think like all these different questions, because you need to ask all those things in order to understand how people think about horses and how that affects what they do with them. If you think back to 19th century, perhaps, when or before, when scientists were doing live experiments on live animals without anesthesia because they thought that animals couldn't feel pain, for example. How we think about animals affects greatly what we do with them, and the same goes for us, our society and our horsemanship and horsekeeping.
So have you started this study?
Yeah. Well, I'm in the grant application stage, because it does cost money to do stuff like this. But yeah, I've started my pilot interviews just to kind of test if my questions were suitable, if I could pronounce the words, because that's always a thing, So I'm sort of like in the early stages of it, yeah.
And do you do some of your questioning like online with email, or do you find that you need to go in person to talk to people? I mean, how is it that you gather your data?
Ideally in person, because then I can also see what people do with their horses, because it does happen that, people give you the answer that they think you want to hear, or that is most culturally acceptable. If I can look at people interact with their animals, I can get a feel if what they're saying, if that is actually what they're doing, and what it looks like. What is it like to live their life? What is it like to experience those interactions that they have with their animals? So yeah, ideally I need to visit all those 200 people and spend some time with them, see them interact with the animals, and then interview them. But that kind of depends on how much funding I'm gonna, get, how much time I have, if the pandemic isn't gonna get worse.
Yeah.
I mean, I can always resort to the internet. I did that for my rodeo study because I, couldn't visit people, so I designed a survey. But to answer your question, ideally you want to visit people face to face and see them interact with the animals and participate in what they're doing and all that.
So that makes me want to ask a very simple question. How do people perceive you when you show up to talk to them? First of all, you found people willing to be part of your study.
Mm-hmm.
That's a whole thing in itself, I'm sure. And then you go to see them, and I'm going to say this honestly, you're female and you're foreign, and you're in the Midwest, or actually Northwest. And having been to the Northwest, especially out where I assume you're in Spokane, the eastern part of the state is very different than the western part of the state. I've actually taught in Deer Park.
Right. Yeah, that's really close. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so I know that I think when you're more out in rural areas, there's a level of suspicion that people have about a stranger. And so how has it been to go out and actually interview people? What's it like?
It's interesting. I don't know if you can tell from this distance, but I also have a couple of piercings in my face, so that makes it even more challenging because I look a little bit differently.
I can't see them,
than,
yes, that would.
So making it difficult for myself. I just kind of start out with the people that I do know. I have a lot of friends and acquaintances in the community, and I post something on Facebook like, I'm doing this study. Do you guys want to help? And plenty of them say, yes, we do want to help. We think it's interesting. And then I may ask them, well, do you know other people who may be interested? Can you get me in touch with them? Or I will go to a couple local Facebook groups like Backcountry Horsemanship of Washington, and I'll post my question there. And yeah, there's always going to be people who think it's stupid, who don't care, who think I'm weird, but there's also going to be people who are interested and who do want to see what it's all about, or who do want to talk to me, or who are just curious. So there's always a way into the community. If you're sincere and if you're sincerely interested in that topic, and if you're not a total outsider, because I am. But I mean, I've been riding horses in the Spokane area for 2 or 3 years. People see pictures of me cleaning out horse stalls, being covered in dirt and snow in the winter. So I'm not, some city girl who, doesn't want to get her nails dirty. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but
no,
I do my best to, yeah.
This is real.
Like, I don't want to judge.
Yeah.
I wish I could keep them nice, but I do my best to fit into the local horse community as much as I can. And, if usually my foreignness is like a selling point, if anything, because it makes me stand out a little bit. I always let people get used to my voice because I do have an accent. Sometimes I mess up some words. That's just part of it. And people generally don't really seem to mind. So that's good.
That's really interesting. Yeah, because, it's so much about culture is people feeling comfortable enough with you in their culture to be who they are. And having lived in smaller communities in different parts of the world, I can so clearly remember walking to a bar in Australia, and they all looked and went, "Oh, you guys are not from here," right? It was like that fast, and the suspicion, the flags that went up was like, "Oh yeah, we're just going to get our drinks and go over there," right?
Right.
So it is interesting, and that would play a huge role in how. Like I said, how honest they are in giving you the answers that you're looking for, or being able to observe what they do and not having them feel subconscious or unconscious. You know what I mean? Unconscious. No. So, anyway.
Self-conscious, maybe?
Self-conscious, that's it. So it was like one of those consciousnesses about what you're trying to do. So it sounds like you're in the early stages of this, but can you say any sort of generalized things that you've started to notice from this study?
Yeah. Like you mentioned, economics is definitely a factor when it comes to health management. We all know it's expensive to go to the vet. So some people choose to not go to the vet. Some people have a specific veterinary budget. So there is a cultural ideal of how a horse should look like and how it should be managed. But then there is reality. And reality, of course, greatly influences what people can do and what people can afford. Another thing that I found really interesting, and I don't want to give any spoilers to my groundbreaking research, of course, but people's distrust into or towards, I don't know what the word is, but veterinarians. Because on one hand, veterinarians are almost venerated because they have this extensive near mythical knowledge, and I'm talking from an anthropological perspective here, of course, but this knowledge that ordinary lay people like me, for example, don't have. But on the other hand, veterinary care is expensive, so people are always really wary of what the veterinarian says. They're like, well, the veterinarian tells me to, vaccinate my horse for 6 different things once every year, but that is way too much. I don't understand why they tell me to vaccinate this much. It's like over vaccinating. It builds up a tolerance. I'm not going to do that. And then they'll be like, oh, the veterinarian told me to deworm my horse X amount of times per year with these medications, but that's way too much. The horse is going to build up a tolerance. So as much as veterinarians are almost admired or venerated for their knowledge, there's also a lot of distrust. What is the motivation behind what the veterinarian is saying? Whose interest do they have in mind? And I found that really interesting because, I mean, I don't own a horse. I know how expensive veterinary care is, but I've never had to, pay those bills myself. So I found that distrust really interesting, and I definitely want to dive into that because what does it mean that people are distrustful of their veterinarian? What does it mean for how they manage their horses? Does it mean that they rely on stuff that they read on the internet, for example? What does that mean? Is that knowledge reliable or not? Do people think it's reliable? So it's all these little like segues, kind of like branches that go into all these different topics. But yeah, that veterinarian distrust, I was kind of surprised by that because I do feel like that is less of a theme in the Dutch equestrian culture. But then again, I don't own a horse, so maybe things are different in reality. But I was a little bit surprised by that.
Well, and then, I mean, the factors where you are, there's a lot of land.
Mm-hmm.
Like the per capita number of vets per acreage is much greater than in Holland, where it's more, the accessibility, I think, is a factor.
Mm-hmm.
Probably another factor is that in Holland, if you do have a horse, because space is so limited, the people who have them can afford them.
Yeah.
So that the health of that horse, because it's valuable in that way, it goes up. Whereas what I find with the larger the land mass, the horses can get left out and people will be like, well, he can figure it out. I can just leave him there and he can figure it out. So there's that factor. And one of the factors that I don't know is whether or not, and I'm not saying that you should take this into consideration, but that I keep hearing is the cost of becoming a vet in this country is so high. And what many people don't realize, like I have a friend and I know she's been practicing for at least, she's still paying on her education. And this is probably 20 years later. And so there's this situation that we're going to get into in this country where it's too expensive to get the schooling. And then we're going to have not enough vets. And then people going out and searching on the internet for an answer is going to become greater. And those vets that are there have to pay their expenses, and so, the economic factors of not only owning a horse, but to become a vet will also start playing into this. And of course, the one that's going to suffer as all that happens is the horse.
Yeah. I mean, or not. Maybe, you know, people in the Netherlands over medicate their horses. Maybe we do call the vet for every tiny little thing, and maybe that is excess, you know. Who knows?
Yeah, yeah. So, all right, so you're in the grant writing stage of your study, and when, let's see, when will you actually think that you'll be, I mean, like when, I'm thinking when we should have you back to find out what you found out.
I hope by the end of the fall, maybe early winter. When I travel back to the US, which will be at the end of June. Well, first I have a horse show, but after that, I'm gonna do some data collection, and that will probably extend until October. So I'll have some preliminary results after that. When the work will be published, academia takes its sweet time, so that will probably be a couple of years from now, but I'll definitely keep you in the loop.
Yeah, that's awesome. So, I mean, given that you've been here for 4 years in the States for 4 years, and you've looked at rodeo and you're looking at veterinary care, do you have any, what are the things that, coming from a different country and a different culture, what has been the things that have either surprised you the most or been something that you found, you know, the most fascinating about our American culture in the Northwest versus Holland?
Oh, so many things. It's hard to pick just one favorite.
Oh, say as many as you like.
What I like is that people don't, at least where I live, so in like in the Northwest, it's a very rural area. People don't fuss with their horses that much. Like horses are, you know, kept as horses. It's not like, oh, we have to wrap them in bubble wrap. No, because they're ranch horses, or they're horses that live in rocky fields. They have to be able to take care of themselves. So when I go to a show, there's, you know, there's dogs, strollers, tents, umbrellas, and the horses don't care. They're just relaxed. They do their thing. They rest when they're not, you know, being ridden. Whereas in the Netherlands, and I don't know if it's a difference because, you know, where I live, we have quarter horses and Appaloosas, and in the Netherlands, we have warm bloods and all that. But in the Netherlands, horses are always so easily spooked by everything. And I had built up a lot of fear riding Dutch horses, but that fear has, you know, knock on wood, you know, completely dissolved itself riding the Appaloosas in Spokane, because I just feel so much safer because the horses don't care. They're just used to everything. They're not, you know, mentally wrapped in bubble wrap. They're just treated as horses. And I really like that. I like that, you know, the horse has to be able to take care of itself, and it has to take care of you as well. And not like where I'm from, like, oh, careful horse, don't spook, you know. Yeah, it's just like a different expectation towards the horse itself, and I really like that. I think it's a more balanced relationship, and this is not me talking as an anthropologist, this is my personal opinion. I think that it's a more balanced relationship between who that horse is supposed to be and who you are as a person. Because I'm afraid of spooky horses because I have ridden so many, or spooky ponies, I guess, but I don't like that. I want my horse to just be aware of where his feet are and not try to kill me, ideally. So I like those ranch horses that don't care about anything. I do really like that.
Yeah, that's interesting. And again, it's, you know, I can't help but wonder how much of that's a result of more land mass, in that the horses are kept out in larger spaces where they have to problem solve on their own because they have the land mass. And in Holland is a tiny country with a huge horse population. And so that just the, and the reason I bring that up is that there's no one solution to how we care for horses, because there are so many different environments like the Northwest. And then you go, you know, to south, you go down to Colombia, where the temperature and the weather is completely different. The issues are complete. And then you go to Holland, where it's a whole nother thing, or Spain, and it's another thing. And so what the environment is like so determines the way in which horses are kept in a lot of respects.
Yeah, but then again, it's also that cultural influence, because where I live in terms of climate, it's not that different from the Netherlands, for example. But like you said, there is a lot more space. The grass isn't as nutrient dense, so
True,
horses have to
yeah.
roam a lot more. They're definitely not as fat as the horses that we have here. So yeah, it's culture, but it is also the environment. It's that balance between nature and culture, I guess. Different
Right.
breeds as well, different breeding. But I do really like that. I like that variability and thinking about that. Like, what is it? What are those factors? And what is it that people do with horses and what they do differently that leads to these different types of animals almost and different relationships and all that?
So are there many people like you studying anthropology in relation to horses, or how horses are influenced in our cultures?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's maybe not necessarily anthropology in itself, but people in social sciences. We have, for example, historians who look at those relationships in the past. We have a couple anthropologists like me who look at horse cultures in a variety of different countries and different contexts. We have sociologists, psychologists, so quite a few people of the social sciences are focusing more and more on human-animal relationships. Like, what does it mean that humans have animals in their lives, and what do we do with these animals? But from all these different perspectives. And so you have like this, and it goes a little bit smaller because there's fewer people who focus on horses, and then fewer people who are actually anthropologists who focus on horses. So few enough for it to be a niche, but enough for me to be able to talk about the subject and to read other people's work and to learn from that and draw from it and all that.
And so how do you hope your work will influence the industry as a whole?
Mm-hmm. I think that people that I hope, well, what I hope is that maybe the industry becomes more aware of the people perspective. In the sense that what people do influences what happens to those horses. And if you look at welfare issues, for example, they start at the people. It's not the horses that consciously overeat or that don't go to the farrier or who want to run with stacks on their hooves. I mean, it's us, it's the people that do it. So in order to be able to get to the root cause of welfare issues, just to name something, you need to understand what the people are doing and what they are thinking and why they do what they do and what they believe and all that, and which factors come into play. So I hope my work can be either a practical guide or a methodological guide that other people can follow, or maybe just an educational example. It doesn't matter, but I do hope that it has some implications in the sense that I can demonstrate that in order to understand what is going on, whether you're talking about welfare or riding or how sport is organized, like any topic in the industry, you need to look at the people that are doing it in order to understand what is going on and what we can improve. For example, what do we need to understand in order to improve these situations of both the horses and the humans that are involved with them, sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I love your answer, because that was not an easy question. And the thing is that it comes back to, we need to understand why those people or how those people see what they're doing before we can ask them to do something different. Because if you just come in and say you've got to change, you confront them and you put up all the barriers. But if we can understand their cultural perspective and why and how things have evolved, then we can address it from their cultural perspective,
Yeah.
and how they could do it different.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, we've come to the end of our hour, and this has just been really fascinating. I had no idea what your research was about. And I just, I'm very excited about this, because I know that if we want to bring about change in the industry, and like yesterday, I had Rebecca Husted, and we talked about, what happens when you lose your owner. Have people planned for that? And that's another cultural thing, whereas, people don't plan what's going to happen if something happens to them. And so the horses are the ones that suffer because of our cultural issues about having a will or having insurance or writing a plan down or any of those things. So this fits right in. And it's
Oh yeah, 100%. Yeah.
yeah, really excited about this. So you do have to let me know when your research is ready for us to come back and talk to you again and find out how things are going.
I definitely will. Thank you so much.
Yep. It's been a pleasure having you. And thank you everybody for joining us today. Yeah, super interesting. Somebody said, never thought of studying this. Looking forward to hearing more. Really, really cool stuff. It's great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me, and everybody have a great day. We'll see you next week. Bye.